Okay. So we're trying to explain the outer circle, which is research philosophy. So I was mentioning that when it comes to research philosophy, we try to look at what should be or ought to be the right or the recommended approach to studying knowledge, okay? And that leads us into several classifications: positivism, realism, interpretivism, or pragmatism. And that is what we call epistemology, the epistemological perspective of philosophy. And there is what we call the ontological perspective of philosophy. That is when it comes to studying reality. Does this exist? Can we capture it objectively, or in capturing it, we can capture it from a constructionist perspective? So we use these two aspects of philosophy to discuss the different kinds of, or the different way of thinking about the processes in conducting research, the processes in studying knowledge. So I was on the positivist, and I said they tend to suggest that the natural sciences approach to inquiry is the best. Okay, that is their position. Knowledge should be approached, or the processes in acquiring knowledge or studying about a phenomenon should follow the natural sciences approach, which involves beginning with a sound logic theory, leading to development of hypothesis, making a hypothetical argument that can be falsified. And by falsification, we mean it can be confirmed or disconfirmed upon collecting data. It can be tested, and the conclusion can be either supported or not supported. And the next step is to collect field data that is objective, devoid of the influence of the researcher. Your values and your beliefs should be detached from the objects you are studying. They should be studied objectively as much as possible, so that you can now analyze that data to test the hypothesis you developed. So you can tell from what we studied yesterday that it tends to follow this positivism or positivist perspective of knowledge acquisition. In essence, it tends to be the standard we are all trying to reach because it is widely accepted. Was someone speaking to the class? Okay, let's continue. Now, a very contrast or a sharp contrast to, no, before I even go to the sharp contrast, one other philosophical stance that is closely related to the positivism is what we call the realism. The critical realist also agrees with the positivist approach to studies, but they believe that sometimes beyond what our natural senses can capture, the natural order of phenomena that we are studying may involve structures that are built based on our reasoning. That is the researcher's reasoning. So they relaxes the positivist approach a little, so that even assumptions we make about the phenomena we are going to study, they allow the researchers the researchers' views in making assumptions about them, but not in collecting the data. The assumptions about the structural organization of the phenomena we are going to study. That is the limit, okay? Whilst the true positivists do not give room for those structural assumptions of the researcher about the structural existence of the phenomena. Things do not happen in isolation. So it is not everything you can study in a laboratory, but we can form our assumptions about how things happen in reality. But then when it comes to collecting data on them, we detach our personal values and beliefs from the real data we are collecting. So that becomes the critical realist approach. Yes, knowledge or facts exist independent of the researcher's construction or interpretation. But when it comes to the natural order in which those phenomena come to existence, we allow the researcher to form their opinions about those assumptions prior to collecting the objective data. So that is a slight difference between realism and positivism. So again, the textbook I'll share with you will even offer you some examples that will help you understand. And for us doing social science research, sometimes using a strict positivism is quite debatable. So most of the times when we claim we are doing positivism, we are rather perhaps using realism other than strict positivism, okay? Now, a sharp contrast to these two is the interpretivism, which suggests that social factors or events or phenomena, they are the construction of human beings. They exist, but their interpretation and how they function are a construction of social beings. So we have to interpret them from the researcher's perspective, how you see it. So we can observe, we can experience, and then write out our experiences, our observations, and our interpretations of those experiences. So you are not able to disintegrate the phenomenon entirely from the person observing it. If somebody wants to say something is hot, it is based on their feeling of touch of that object, and they say it is hot. There is no an objective, an objective measure of degree of hotness may not necessarily exist, but that interpretation is based on the social being catching it and feeling it and interpreting it as hot. Now that brings about the issue of subjectivity. So what it means is that researcher A can touch it, and based on how thick and hard their palm is, they may say it is hot or not too hot. So when it comes to interpretivism world of view about research, it gives room for interpretations based on the observer or the one conducting the research. And the problem with that is it introduced a lot of biases because of the high degree of subjectivity. Its ontological perspective is subjectivity, whereas the positivist is objectivity. So the social things that phenomena around us in the home, at the business, at school, at workplace, in the larger society, they are being constructed by people. So let's allow the people to interpret, to observe, to feel, and communicate their interpretation, okay? But the danger with that is there is a high degree of bias that can be introduced depending on who is conducting the study. But it is still a valid way of worldview of knowledge inquiry, because it is not everything you can study in the laboratory. It is not everything you can study strictly by the scientific approach. So this is also a valid and also a widely used worldview to research. Now, the only issue is that you try to minimize the extent to which biases could be subjected into the study. It is a reason we are studying research methods. Now, the other one is pragmatism. So a pragmatist perspective says that instead of allowing these extreme positions, positivism and interpretivism, to determine how we study knowledge, let's allow the things we are going to study tell us how we should approach it. So the approach or the position you choose should be based on the kind of research questions you are pursuing. So if you have like 3 research questions and one of them suggests that the best way to study it is to use the positivist approach, then fine, go with the positivist. If your research question suggests that the best way to study it is an interpretivist point of view, then you adapt it. Instead of taking an entrenched position as I'm a positivist and everything I study must be positivist oriented, or I'm an interpretivist, so everything I should study must follow that. No. But with pragmatism, let's look at what we are studying. What is the question? What is the best way to study it? If it calls for a mix of the two, use it. If it calls for one, use it. But do not take an entrenched position concerning these philosophical perspectives. So likewise, when you are conducting a research, as part of your design, we want to know which of these school of thoughts you belong to. Okay, so you will have to make a small discussion of your knowledge about it and which of them you belong to and why you choose that and why it fits your study. So that is it. Now, the second layer is approach. And these approaches sometimes are closely related to the philosophical stance. So let's begin from the bottom. Then we jump to the top and then come in between. Induction approach follows that you begin with a theory, and theory will guide you through hypothesis development and data collection. So right away, to test those theories, to confirm them into laws or not. So that approach, mostly if you choose a positivist or a realism philosophical stance, you are most likely to go with the induction approach to research. Then its sharp contrast is the deduction. Just from the literal meaning of the word, you deduce. It begins with collecting empirical evidence, analyzing the evidence to arrive at certain patterns or logic, and therefore a theory. So it is the direct opposite of the induction approach. And the deductive reasoning usually aligns itself much with the interpretivist philosophical stance. And then we have abduction. Sometimes you may combine both. You may not strictly go for induction or deduction, but you combine the idea of starting with some level of theory, induction, and collecting evidence before you conclude on anything. So that becomes abduction, and that tends to follow from either a pragmatic stance of research philosophy. Now, depending on whatever you choose here, the next thing you have to think about in your design is methodological choice. Okay, and the methodological choice has to do with how you are actually going to capture data from the empirical setting. Okay, and there are two key ones: quantitative and then qualitative. Quantitative and qualitative, these two. Quantitative means you are going to assign a numeric value to the observations you make. You are going to quantize the data you capture from the field in order to be able to analyze them with statistical softwares. Qualitative means that you are going to qualitatively describe in words, whether in the form of a video, whether in the form of a text, images, other than using numeric values to capture your observations. Okay. In this model, it is expanded such that we have mono-quantitative, and usually the mono-quantitative approach tends to follow an induction approach and a positivist philosophical stance. Then we have the mono-qualitative. Mono-qualitative, that's purely a qualitative study. It's most likely to align itself with a deductive approach and interpretivist philosophical stance. Now, knowledge is complex, so sometimes we mix the two. So we have multi-method quantitative. Such that I made that. When you mix them, we have what we know as a mixed quantitative, mixed method simple. And then we can have even a complex one, mixed method complex. So mixed method simple is when you are drawing on both quantitative and qualitative. Mixed method complex occurs when you are combining multiple quantitative or multiple qualitative with the opposite, then it becomes mixed method complex. Now, what is multi-method quantitative? There can be several forms of quantitative data that can strongly agree, strongly disagree, and all those stuffs. When your study is more quantitative with the various forms of quantitative metrics you are using, with just a small aspect of qualitative, then it becomes a multi-method quantitative in that it is stronger in the quantitative sense, but it is weaker in the qualitative sense. Then it becomes multi-method. Then it can also be multi-method qualitative, where the qualitative aspect is more stronger, but there is a small aspect of quantitative aspect in there. Okay, so the sharp contrast is what will be aligned to the extremes of positivism and interpretivism, whereas the mixes will always or will mostly align themselves with a pragmatism stance of philosophy. Then the next layer or decision you have to take is around how you approach or how you go into the field, or what we call the strategies in extracting or actually collecting the data from the field, having determined how you are going to capture the data you collect. Now, how do you zoom into the field and capture those data, whether quantitative or qualitative or even a mix of them? So we can use the experimental approach where you try to study the phenomenon you are studying in a controlled environment, removing all the effect of all possible environmental factors. And as you would agree with me, this goes mostly with the strict scientific approach, that is the positivist approach. And it is not always feasible in the social science, but that doesn't mean it cannot be used. It can be used in the social science as well. Okay, we have social science experiments, experimental studies. It can happen. But what you try to do in experimental study is that you try to control the study environment. Okay, so you can have objects that you use as control group. You subject an effect to that group, and the other group, you let it be. You do not apply. You allow the natural environment to influence that group. Then you see how the effect of whatever treatment you are giving to one group is having on that group, and the control group that you are not adding, you are not applying any treatment to, will also respond to the environment. So in social sciences, we are able to use experimental designs, only it must be carefully done. But in most cases, it aligns itself with the positivist way of thinking. So with experiments, you normally will put your sample that you are collecting data from into at least 2 groups. It can be more than that, depending on the kind of treatment you want to give. So if you have only 1 treatment to give, then the basic groupings can be 2. If you have more than 1 treatment, then it will correspond to the number of treatments you want to give plus the control group. So you want to make a case that when you apply a certain treatment to a certain section of your sample, they might react differently. And in order to be able to make sure your effects or the treatment you are proposing that it will elicit certain characteristics, you need to really control the environment well. All right. Then where you try to target a larger portion of the population in their natural environment, where they exist, where they operate, but you want to sample a huge of them so that you can make conclusions that can be generalized across the population. So usually when you want to make generalization about a population, you want to sample from that population and target and design your study as a survey so you can reach a good number of them, such that your sample selection is highly representative of the population you are studying. So for instance, if it's your class that we are studying as the population, our sample should be very representative of the population of this class in terms of gender, in terms of age, even the background with which you are coming to study the business analytics course. In that way, when we pick that sample we are studying, we can say that, oh, it has people from computer science are represented. Okay, people from business and maybe social are also represented here. Then you want to say that, oh, in terms of gender, females and males are reasonably or well represented in the sample. So that whatever conclusion we make, generalization we make, conclusion we make from that studying that small sample, we can generalize it for the entire population. Okay. And in most cases, survey studies also tend to be aligned with the quantitative method and also an induction approach or reasoning, and hence for philosophical stance. It tends to align with that, with those line of reasoning. Then we have what we call archival research. Sometimes the variables you want to study or the phenomenon you want to study exist in historical records. They have been archived over the years, so you do not need to go and study them in real time, but you can leverage on these records to study patterns and to study relationships. So we normally call that secondary data. Okay. And a typical example is what you find from the World Bank's database, from a Ghana Stock Exchange, from companies' archives and stuff like that. So they have been compiled over time that you can access and then use them for your study. And depending on the form they take, it can be quantitative, it can be qualitative, it can be mixed. All right. If there are figures, numbers about sales, profits, and stuff like that, it become more quantitative. It's about reports, news items, and stuff like that has been compiled, or even from a social media platform that have been compiled over years that you are looking at. It could be strictly qualitative for sentiment analysis, or it could be a mix of them. So it doesn't necessarily align itself to one specific research method or approach or philosophy. And then we have case study. A case study is when you really want to describe or explore a phenomenon or an event in detail, so that you pick an environment or a setting that those phenomena you are studying occur naturally. So you can give a deep and accurate profile of whatever issue you are studying. So normally when we say a research and we say it's a case study, it means we are picking a specific or a number of specific settings that contain that phenomenon we want to study in its real stature or real context. So we visit these settings, and then we can do an in-depth study to come out with an accurate profile or description of the phenomena we are studying. So it is common to see in some theses that maybe examining corruption in public sector, the case of maybe which town should I use? Let me say Ejiso Municipal Assembly. So you have picked a context in which you want to study corruption. So when you go there, you are able to give a deep profile or description of the phenomenon corruption in its real context, in an environment where it really happens. Now, how you do that could be qualitative, like analysis approach. It could be quantitative by picking certain documents, records from the accounts people or whatever. It could be also a mix, but the emphasis is that you pick a context where the phenomenon exists in its real life situation. Then you go in there to provide a deep or an accurate profile of the phenomenon you want to study. It becomes a case study. So you realize that in terms of scope, when you compare case study and survey, case study will be limited, survey is vast. And then we have mixed method research, where you may combine any of the approaches or the strategies we are discussing here. Then, especially towards the purely qualitative aspect, we have ethnography, where the researcher will have to go into the context where the phenomenon you are interested in exists. You do not just go in there, you become like one of the members of that group. You live with them over a long time, you study, you observe, and you make your analysis from it. Here, it must be such that it is a current setting, it is a current occurrence where the researcher himself or herself can be found in that context, live with the people, study them, act with them, and come out with their with his or her conclusions. So I think a popular example we can have is what most of the times these DNI. You mentioned something. Is someone speaking? All right. So the researcher zooms into the social context in which the phenomenon of interest occurs, and they involve themselves in the real life experience throughout with the people, and then they make their observations, their deductions, and all that. So that tends to align very much with the qualitative, a purely qualitative approach to studies. Then we have action research. Action is about action. A real organizational problem that needs to be solved through research. But you involve the organization such that you study the problems, how they manifest, together with the organization whilst they are operating. Then when you offer solutions, the solutions are acted upon within their normal operations, their real life operations. Then you observe outcomes to make improvements till you have solved the problem. So with action research, it can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, it can be mixed. The only distinction from the others is that there is a real life organizational problem that needs solution. And you, the researcher, together with the organization, work as a team throughout their actual operations and management to get the problem resolved. So you are more or less like a consultant brought into the organization to work with them through all the activities and through picking data from their operations and their activities day in, day out to come out with a solution to the problem. So narrative, inquiry, and grounded theory are also other forms of qualitative research that also are usually conducted in social sciences. With grounded theory, The emphasis here is about studying phenomena from different perspectives in their real social context, so that at the end of the day, you can make a strong proposition towards the development of a theory. So you study from different sources about the phenomenon in its context. It's a form of achieving what we call triangulation, studying it from different perspectives, studying it from multiple accounts of the same event, so that at the end of the day, you can make a strong proposition towards the development of a theory. Now, when it comes to narrative inquiry, there are phenomena that happens in the past, or like historical events that has occurred, and you need to study those events, why they happened, how they happened, and how it has influenced even current habits. But they are deeply rooted into people's culture. They are deeply rooted in people's experience, real life experience with those events. So you sit with people, they narrate the accounts, and you, the researcher, will make deductions from those accounts to answer your research problem or research question. So clearly, these tend to align themselves much with purely qualitative studies and interpretivist point of view. You listen to people's accounts, recounting events that they have had a first-hand experience with, and you, the researcher, learns from those narratives, and then you make your conclusions. Okay. So having taken a stance with respect to the strategies you deem appropriate to study the events you want to study, the next question is it going to be cross-sectional or longitudinal? Are you going to study it at a specific time, just one time spot, or you are going to study it at different time spots? So longitudinal means you pick the data at one point in time, and then another point in time, you go back to pick data again. It could be on the same variable or different variables. Once you are picking your data at different points in time, we consider that longitudinal. You are making room for the lapse of time to allow variables to change, or allow one phenomenon to result into another phenomenon. So it all boils down to what you are studying and what you think will be the best way to capture that data. And then the cross-sectional is that that the basic assumption here is that you believe that time has nothing. Lapse of time may have nothing to do with the variables or the phenomenon you are studying. So you can just pick one simple point in time, a single point in time, to capture all the data you need, and you'll be fine. So once you've been able to make all the decisions from the outer shell all the way to this point, then the next thing is, that is the time horizon. The next thing is, now go ahead and collect your data. Of course, what it means is that you should have determined how you are going to capture data. You have your instrument ready and all that. So you collect your data and analyze. So this is briefly what we go through in research design. We will go through a couple of them, just what needs to be emphasized. So broadly speaking, we have qualitative research and then quantitative research. What are they? Okay, so qualitative research are those whose findings are not subject to quantification. You are not able to put a numerical value on it that can be interpreted numerically. Okay, and its research conclusions are not based on precisely measurable statistics, but on more subjective observations and analysis. I believe this is straightforward based on the discussions we've had already. All right. Now, when it comes to quantitative, it uses mathematical, statistical, or analytical procedures. Okay. It tries to quantize the data it collects or the data points it observes, and then use statistical tools to analyze and make quantitative or objective judgment or reality or sense out of the conclusions. I think someone has a mic on. If you're not speaking to us, kindly mute yourself. Okay. So those are the simple explanation to what a qualitative and a quantitative research is. So this is something you may also want to pay attention to. Distinguishing between qualitative and quantitative research. What are the stark differences between the two? So with the type of questions, a qualitative research might use a more probing approach, whereas quantitative probing is limited. So for instance, you ask a question, how do you think the Akufo-Addo government is doing? Oh, very excellent. Then you ask how. That is probing. Oh, there is free education. Really? How free is it, and what about the quality? So that is sort of probing, okay? But in quantitative, you only put a scale there. To what extent do you think Akufo-Addo government is performing? Then they will rate the extent to which. Whatever they rate, you are not there to ask them further questions. Why are they rating it high or low? So there is limited probing in terms of the type of questions you ask when it comes to quantitative. All right. Okay, so obviously when it comes to sample size, because qualitative involves in-depth studies and then asking more probing questions, you are only able to sample a few. Whereas in quantitative, because you want to arrive at make some generalization with your findings, it usually involves a larger sample, like survey studies. Then with respect to the amount of information from each respondent, of course, with qualitative, you are able to capture a substantial amount of questions because information, because you can ask further questions and so what, and then you can get a lot of information. But when it comes to qualitative, it varies, it depends. Sometimes you can set varied quantitative questions that will elicit a wealth of information from the respondent, but relatively, the depth and width and breadth of information, the depth of information and both the depth and breadth of information goes to qualitative. And with quantitative, it can be deep or it can be wide. So sometimes it's difficult to achieve both, except when you are dealing with a panel data or when you are dealing with longitudinal study. That is where you are able to achieve both. So that is why we have the varies. When it comes to requirement for administration, that is the requirements for you to conduct the empirical study. Qualitative research requires the interviewer to have special skills. It is not anybody you just appoint to go and conduct interview for you. If the person doesn't know how to ask the right questions in the right tone to elicit the right responses, you will lose. If the interviewer doesn't have the skill, the personal skills and the social skills to engage with people so that even when they don't want to speak about or they are trying not to they are trying to dodge an issue, they can find a way around to make them say what they wanted to say. Okay. But when it comes to the qualitative research, you do not really need very special skills from the interviewer or the one administering the questionnaires. Just getting the person to receive the questionnaire and filling it and coming back another time to pick it up is just enough. Sometimes they just have to submit a letter, an introduction letter to an organization for the organization to fetch for them the data they are requiring. It doesn't need so much special skills. And then type of analysis. Since qualitative data is qualitative in nature, it is subjective and interpretive. You read or you observe or you examine the objects, the behavior, and you interpret it. And there is a level of subjectivity because you, the one interpreting it, do so or does so based on how you judge things, how your values are, what your beliefs are about certain stuffs. So there is high level of subjectivity, and it is all about interpretations. Now, when it comes to quantitative, the way of analyzing quantitative data, we use statistical tools, including summation, correlations, the generation of movements, descriptives, and stuff like that. All right, so it is devoid of the person analyzing the data's subjective interpretations or emotions or feelings or values and beliefs. The software does the work and you present the findings as the software suggests. So there is some level of objectivity when compared to the qualitative approach. Now, hardware used in qualitative research, that is the form the data can take, determines the hardware that can be used. So if it's audio, you might need some sound recorders. If it's a video, you may need some video recorders. If it's images, it might take the form of cameras to capture pictures and stuff like that. And then if it is observations that you are taking notes, then it could include diaries and stuff like that, okay? But when it comes to quantitative, the hardware instruments you might use include a physical questionnaire, that is a printed questionnaire, computers that may host soft versions of the questionnaire for answering, like Google Forms and the rest online. Okay. Or it could be mobile devices where you have developed an app that hosts the questionnaire for administration. All right. In terms of the degree of replicability, replicability refers to the extent to which a study can be repeated the same way. Okay. When it comes to qualitative, it is low because a lot of subjective variables are at play. The context might even change the next time you want to study. Maybe you did an interview during a particular season in the year or a particular time in the year where the economic conditions were different, so people were agitated. If you want to repeat the same study, it will be very difficult for you to get or do that same interview with that same person and at that same economic period. So a lot of variables are at play that will change from one researcher to the other researcher, and even from the time the first research was done to the time the second research was done, such that it becomes difficult to create the same ambience, the same scenarios, the same feelings, the same emotions. So replicability is relatively low for qualitative research, whereas quantitative, it tends to be high. So these things are debatable, but relatively, repeatability is high in quantitative and low in qualitative. Okay. Now, researcher training. What sort of training must a researcher have, or should a researcher have to be able to conduct each of these types? When it comes to qualitative, you might need some good background in psychology, sociology, social psychology, consumer behavior, marketing and marketing research, and all those stuff. Because you need to be well informed about social and psychological issues before you engage in the research. It helps you minimize biases. It helps you interpret things from the right perspectives. But when it comes to quantitative, because of the limited risk of your social and psychological factors influencing the study, the training that the researcher might need is mainly that which is related to statistics, decision models, decision support systems, computer programming like SPSS, Excel, and then marketing and just the basic knowledge in research as we are all we are sharing through this course. Okay. And when it comes to the type of research, qualitative tends to align with an exploratory research. And then quantitative tends to align with descriptive or causal research. Just as we explained for the previous slide, when it comes to the type of reasoning or approach, qualitative research tends to align itself with the deductive reasoning, and then quantitative tend to align itself with the inductive reasoning. So you should be able to clearly distinguish between qualitative research and quantitative research. Any question so far from that before we move to the next? All right. So either qualitative or quantitative or a mix of the two, there is data to be collected. How do you construct the data? So we will discuss data construction from the two broad perspectives. That's qualitative and quantitative data construction. Please kindly alert me when it is time for break. Okay. That will be like 10. So unless you don't want the break, we continue. Okay. So what are data? So we have the singular form is datum, and the form we normally use in our parlance is data, and it is plural. So that's why you see what are data. Okay. So there are some popular conceptions about data that they are facts. or things given, untainted, not transformed. But when they are the raw facts that have been given to us, we call them data. In themselves, they may not make absolute sense until we collate them, analyze them, identify patterns, and then we begin to make sense from them. That's the process of analysis, summarization, analysis, and then we get information. Okay. Information is usually more meaningful than data. So data becomes more or less like the granulars of information. Then when they are organized, analyzed, then we get information. Okay. So data is also known to be true. It is facts in their rawest form, untainted by interpretations or values or beliefs, and then unaffected by our social values. Those are some of the conceptions we have about data. But in reality, the truth is that based on our knowledge from research philosophy, data can be the constructions of individuals. Either they are mental constructions or what they have recorded into records, like what accountants keep. Data does not exist all by itself. It is created by human interactions and also the natural environment and other objects existing in the ecosystem. But sometimes it takes humans to capture them and to put them. So there is some level of human construction in data. Data are also social products. Attitude towards internet security is going to be a data that is a social product. Fraud is not an object, it's a social thing that comes by through social interactions. So data vary considerably in terms of quality. Yes, you can have high quality data, poor quality data due to how they have been constructed and captured. Okay. And then quality is judged in many different ways, which we will look at. The quality of data is judged in many different ways, which we will be looking at subsequently. And then data are of very different types. You can capture different types of data. Okay. Can be qualitative, it can be quantitative, and when you pick each of them, it might also take different forms. Qualitative can be audio, it can be video, it can be text, it can be images, it can be feelings. I don't know how you represent that, but it can be feelings. Feelings can be captured from using infographics and emojis and stuff like that. So, all right. So, data proper. They are systematic records that have been constructed by researchers or other individuals using a plan or a design for research. So, there is a lot of reasoning and planning and designing about data, what we are interested in, how we are going to construct and capture it. Okay, so having designed and planned for the data capture, you actually go to capture the data by recording them to mean what you observe, recording them in a form that will make you go back to determine what you actually observed from the field. And then assembling it, putting it together, and preparing it for analysis. Okay, so when it comes to data capture, how can it be captured? These are familiar to us. You can capture data using a questionnaire, diaries of events, keeping a diary, that is keeping notes on events. And then you can use electronic recording devices like tape recorders, video cameras, meters, then passive sensing devices like RFIDs, and the internet, depending on where your data that you are interested in exists and the form in which they exist and what you think is the best way to capture them. Assembling data. This involves collating the data from the sources you used and putting them together. So if it's questionnaire, bringing all the questionnaires you have administered together is part of assembling. If there are tips or videos, bringing them together is what it's the first step of assembling. And the next step is to import data from, the other way of assembly is to import them from other sources. If you use like internet sources or different platforms on the internet, bringing them together is part of assembly. Sometimes you may have conducted your survey online and some offline. You might have conducted your interview, some online, like we are having this online class, and then some offline. Bringing these data sources together constitutes assembling the data. And another level you can look at which you can look at assembly of data is entering them into a data analysis software package. It could be a quantitative data analysis software package, organizing the data into a form that the software can interpret is part of data assembly. If it's qualitative data analysis software, how you organize your audio files, your video files, your transcriptions for the software to organize them for interpretation, for analysis is also part of data assembly. Types of data. So from our discussions, it is obvious the two types are either qualitative or quantitative. So we wouldn't spend much time here. And the sources of the data. It can be published either open, commercial. If not open, you have to buy or pay for it. It can be internal archival records. Okay. Published media and commercial sources, and the internal archival records. Now, when you pick data, you need to think about certain things about the data. Who produced them? Who constructed them? Why were they collected? For what purpose were they collected? How were they collected? What was the strategy or the methods or the approach used in collecting the data? And then when were they collected? The time they were collected. Because depending on who collected the data or who produced the data or who constructed the data might not be reliable. Okay. If you collect data from a gossip, you can't rely on that. But when you collect data from the right informants, somebody whom it is believed to have deep knowledge or adequate knowledge about the data, then you can rely on that data. When the data was collected, why the data was collected is important. Data collected for purposes other than what you are going to study may not help you much. So you should understand why the data was collected, for what purposes, and ask yourself, can that data be applied to or for my purposes? How they were collected also has a bearing on the validity of the data. The procedure through which the data was collected might not be ethical or might not be appropriate to make the data valid for the purposes for which you want to use the data. So These are questions you ask yourself when you are evaluating data. And then, when were they collected? Remember, from the beginning, we said we conduct research to come out with relevant, accurate, and timely information to support management decision-making. So if the data was collected at a time where if you apply it currently, it wouldn't make much sense, then that data is outdated and will not be important or relevant for the current research to contribute to informed decision-making in the presence. So when the data was collected, it becomes a subject of for evaluation. So normally in your analysis, when you have collected data in your analysis, you speak to these issues. Who are the respondents who responded to the questionnaire or who were involved in the interview? Are they relevant people with the background that we are confident in them to be able to produce information that is relevant to our subject of discussion? Okay, so these are some of the questions you ask yourself, and in your write-up, you need to produce the answers to these kind of questions to make your audience believe and have confidence in what you are presenting to them. So how do we construct qualitative data? So there are multiple ways we can construct qualitative data. These data are not subject to quantification, that is assigning quantities to the data observations, okay? And most of the popular techniques that can be used include focus group, in-depth interviews, as well as others like ethnography, hermeneutics, and a lot of them. So we will focus our attention on the first two in this course. Of course, you can read around the rest. So factors to consider when you are constructing qualitative data or when you are preparing to obtain qualitative data. Time and budget. Time and budget because qualitative data might require time, a lot of time to be spent with one interviewee. You may be asking a lot of questions. You may be asking a lot of follow-up questions. If it is an ethnography where you have to go and live with the people and learn from them, you need to live with them, spend a significant portion of your life living in the context of the phenomenon and studying. And that can include substantial budget allocation. If it's interviews, you need to travel. You need to book offices or spaces for an office space, or even sometimes buy lunch to get somebody in an interview. So it's a whole lot. You need to consider time and budget. How the research results will be used. When you have obtained your data from qualitative study, how are you going to use the results? Okay. You should have an idea of that before you even go out there, because how you will analyze them and use them will help you capture the data in the right way. The product or service tangibility. How tangible is it? Whatever you are going to study, if it is intangible, how are you going to capture it? If it's tangible, how are you going to capture it? The research goals and objectives. What objectives do you seek to achieve in your research? The participants' availability and willingness. Are there the right respondents? who can speak to the issue you are interested in. Are they even available? Maybe they are available, but you don't even know them. Even if they are available, are they even willing? For instance, you want to talk to rape victims. How do you even identify the rape victims? Who are they? How many of them do you even know? Is there a record somewhere that lists all people who have suffered or are victims of rape? And even when you see them, would they be willing to go through sharing their experience with you? Desired analysis sophistication. What is the extent of analysis that needs to be done? The level of sophistication of it. You need to take all that into consideration before you collect the data. If you collect data that requires some sort of analysis that you are not capable of doing, are there people you can contract or engage their services to do it for you? If not, based on what you know, how do you even capture the data so that you can analyze it yourself or with available knowledge and techniques? Whether quantitative research may follow, you may need to think about it that after this my qualitative study, will it be necessary do I intend to follow it up with a quantitative study? That is also necessary in your consideration, because if that is the case, then you'll be looking out for clues how to even design your quantitative study whilst you are doing your qualitative study. You may need to capture certain variables that will help you construct your quantitative study during the qualitative data analysis collection. So let's look at one of the qualitative studies and how to construct the data for it. So we have the focus group. So what is it? It is a group of participants ranging from 8 to 12 in number, who are led by a moderator in an in-depth discussion on one particular topic or concept. Okay, so when you have a team of from 8 to 12 that you want to engage them to discuss in depth about a particular topic or concept, then that becomes a focus group. And the focus group must have what we call, or who we call, a moderator, somebody who will introduce the group to what discussion we are starting, and will be inciting them to discuss on the topic, asking questions and directing the conversation to elicit the matter you are interested in discussing. So let me ask, can anyone share with us an instance where using a focus group discussion would be more appropriate for a research, given what we have just explained about what a focus group is? Can you think of an instance, a scenario where using such an approach to collect data will be most appropriate? Any suggestion? Hello. All right, Nancy.
Yes, you see, sometimes when a company does their research and then develops a new version of a product, a focus group can be a really good way to gather users' opinion on that developed product, at least compared to other. Yes.
Exactly. So that is excellent. When an issue is not one-sided, it has multiple faces, it has multiple ways of reasoning about it, there are diverse perspectives about it, then you want to engage people you believe have knowledge on the issue, but may come from different backgrounds. You bring them together, and that kind of conversation can lead to useful outcomes. So like Nancy also suggested, you have different customers with different tastes, different perspective about quality and all that, or even different priority for pricing and stuff like that. So when you bring them together on a focus group discussion about how the new product is being received by them, you can learn a lot from such focus group discussion with customers. So that's wonderful. Let's see.
Yeah, no, that's the point.
So if you are not speaking to us, kindly mute yourself. So some key characteristics of focus group. It's good for idea generation, brainstorming, and understanding customer vocabulary. So like we just talked about. Can be helpful in gaining insight to motives, attitudes, and perceptions. That is diverse motives, attitudes, and perceptions. It can reveal needs, likes or dislikes, prejudice driven by emotions. You have brought multiple people on a round table engaged in discussing a common idea. People with different emotions will speak to elicit or to trigger other emotions here and there and attitudes here and there, and you can get perceptions, how they vary from different people on the same topic. Okay, so when you want to exhibit the group dynamics on a particular concept or issue, then focus group tends to be the best approach to constructing that kind of qualitative data. All right. So the role of the moderator is very crucial because the moderator needs good knowledge about these group dynamics in order to navigate the discussion so that you don't veer off. Sometimes one person wants to take center stage so that when they speak, nobody else speaks. You should be able, as a moderator, you should be able to manage all those stuffs. People may use offensive and abusive words. As a moderator, you should skillfully curtail such instances so that even those who don't want to speak much can be given the opportunity to speak, other than allowing the extroverts and the talkative like myself to take center stage. So how do you conduct a focus group? 4 basic steps. The first step is where you prepare for the group. By preparing for the group means you determine who should be the participant in the focus group. You must also determine a facility where you will host the group. Either a hotel conference room, wherever will be more conducive, free from distractions, so that, and then conducive enough to make the participant comfortable to engage in the discussion, preparing to provide maybe some snacks, some water, and some of anything that will help the discussion go on. Okay. And then you recruit the participants. You recruit the participants. Okay. The second step is selecting a moderator and you create a discussion guide. It is sometimes in qualitative studies, in order to minimize the biases that you, the researcher, can inject into the study, you try to separate yourself from the data collection as much as possible. So in this case, you can increase or minimize the level of subjectivity or your you, the researcher, your biases introduced in the study by appointing a different person to be the moderator other than you, the researcher yourself. So you prepare a discussion guide for that person, you recruit the moderator, and you discuss with the moderator how you want the discussion to go, or what topic you want information on, and how they should go about the discussion or initiating the discussion. And you leave everything to that expert to moderate the discussion for you. So obviously the third step is to conduct the group. Once you have you have prepared the facility and those who are going to be members of the focus group discussion and the moderator for the focus group, you carry out the focus group, and then you prepare the focus group report based on the discussions, what came from the discussions. So this is just a breakdown of those steps. So step one, decide on the way, the key focus group objectives. Use secondary research to hone questions. You may need to do an initial exploration of the questions you are going to ask to make sure that they are well constructed, and when they are posed, the listeners or the focus group participants will understand them in the way you intended them to understand it, to elicit the kind of responses you need. It's a forth and back something. You need other people to look at it for you to help improve the questions, and you must know the questions by heart, or the moderator must know the questions by heart, so that when you ask, you can, if it's not clear, you can re-put it so that you don't lose the meaning of the questions. And of course, selecting the focus group facility and the participants, and you begin recruiting after deciding on participants' incentives. Sometimes you need to provide them transportation, some certain allowance, if necessary, depending on who you are engaging in the focus group. So select a moderator, we talked about it, and develop a moderator guide or a chat flow for the focus group so that the moderator can follow. So at the end of the day, the discussions can go the way you really wanted it. And then the third step is to conduct the focus group. And it's generally about 2 hours. You draw people away from their usual activities, their jobs, whatever, their families. You can't let them sit for a very long time. And the fourth stage is you reviewing if it was tape recorded, video recorded, whatever. If it were notes taken, you review them and prepare a written report. Okay, so that is how you go about the focus group discussion. Any questions so far? Okay. So this is just an expansion of what we looked at. So now some important issues about or some tips in it all. You need to build rapport when you are dealing with qualitative data collection in general. You are dealing with social beings, people who have emotions, who react to your actions and your inactions. So, especially for the one who is moderating it, you need to be able to smile, make connection with individuals, generate the positive emotions you need from them to respond to the issue at hand. Get quite physical. Okay? Shake hands. If you can hug. Just create that social ambience to make people be themselves, feel wanted, feel recognized, so that they can interact with you as though they knew you before, although they just met you. Try and turn on the charm. Make an extra effort to respond warmly to people. So these tools and techniques are all about creating that relaxed social environment, ambience to allow people to speak out freely and give all that you want from them, okay? Show empathy. Do not be too hard on your face. Do not be too robotic, but show concern. When the people feel hot and they are fanning themselves with their handkerchiefs and their hands, you should know if someone is coughing, you should be concerned and strive to find a solution or to offer a relief to them and all that. Be sensitive to words you use and control the kind of words others may use, which might affect other people's emotion. So just be real and sincere. Less of faking smiles and lying or making insincere statements about anything. Don't promise people what you don't have or what you can, but be sincere and be objective enough. Then mind the details when you are organizing the focus group. So people are very concerned about the 13th item 13. So if they are to be provided to make the group discussion interesting and make the participant more comfortable, make sure you provide them. All right. So when you have closed, make sure you do the necessary human things, making a final statement to appreciate their effort, their time, their energy, and then a firm goodbyes, just as you would want from anybody, from other people. So these are some of the techniques you should be mindful of when you are organizing a focus group. Even it might apply to an in-depth interview, even if it's one person, okay? Any questions? Would you like to take the break 30 minutes from now?
Yeah, it's break.
Sure. Okay, so we return at 10:30 to continue.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Why? Okay. You engage an individual in a discussion on a topic where you seek to dig more to uncover hidden motivations or emotions or hidden information. Okay. All right. So the basic distinction is, whilst focus group, you are looking at bringing out a group of people who will discuss in brief on an issue. Here, the focus is on an individual, one-on-one discussions, so you can delve much deeper. You need to understand the instances or circumstances that may warrant or will make focus group appropriate, as well as instances or circumstances that will make in-depth interview more appropriate. So we are looking at the advantages of in-depth interview. And when you look at the flip side, it gives you the disadvantages of focus group interview. So at the end of the day, whatever advantage you see here, you can look at the flip side to discuss it as a disadvantage or a limitation for focus group discussion. So group pressure is eliminated when you are dealing with one-on-one interviews. The person can express themselves more freely and devoid of the pressure coming from the presence of another who may talk on the issue or who may speak to the issue. So the only group you see here is you, the interviewer, and the interviewee. So there isn't much people around, eyes around, that will put so much pressure on the interviewer. And respondents feels important and truly wanted. When you engage someone on a one-on-one interview discussion, you create the impression that their expertise is highly sought for. They are so important that you are engaging them to be an expert on that issue, to give you their opinion. You are trusting their expertise, and you are putting them in that position where they feel like they are valuable, important people, okay? And then respondents attain a heightened awareness. Kindly mute yourself if you are not speaking to the class, okay? All right. And it also encourages the revelation of new information. Since there isn't much of group pressure, certain information can be divulged. If there are other third parties listening, that they may feel like they are speaking in public, so they wouldn't want to say certain things. But when it's a one-on-one discussion, the level of detail can be much more compared to when that individual is speaking to an issue when other listeners are around. You wouldn't know who will took you from behind. Okay. Respondents can be questioned at length to reveal feelings and emotions. Since it is a one-on-one discussion, there is no other onlookers. So even if you have to go to the extent of probing further to reveal deeper emotions and then some feelings, it is relatively possible in a one-on-one interview than when you are in a focus group discussion. So there is that aspect also in the advantages for in-depth interview. Individual interviews allow greater flexibility to the direction of questioning. Sometimes, because it's a one-on-one discussion, you may even ask a question and they jump to answer a question you intended asking before they come back to it. Because there is no, there aren't other participants around who also want to speak to the same issue. There is that kind of flexibility. Sometimes the discussion can veer off and still come back to the topic because it is one-on-one. And the interviewer becomes more sensitive to nonverbal feedback. Because there are no other parties involved, but just one-on-one, the interviewee is most likely able to freely express nonverbal cues and make certain expressions that the interviewer can pick them out. But in a group, some of these nonverbal cues and feelings and emotions will be subdued, maybe subdued in the presence of other peers. Now, a singular viewpoint can be obtained without influence from others. The same advantage that goes for focus group discussion where people's views can influence or elicit other people's views on the topic, becomes an advantage here, becomes the opposite here, that the singular view can be obtained without interferences and influences from other members. Sometimes in a focus group discussion, when you are presenting your opinion about something, you are evaluating it indirectly or subconsciously against what somebody else said, so that you become more careful what to say. And by so doing, your opinion is being influenced by what maybe the most influential person on the focus group discussion said or mentioned. But in a one-on-one interview, you can obtain the untainted perspective of that person without anybody's influence. Okay. So interviews can be conducted anywhere. Because it's a one-on-one arrangement, there is more flexibility in picking a location and time to conduct in-depth interview. But when it's focus group, you are bringing multiple people together. So there's a need to look out for what time will work for all of them, which location will be most central to all of them. Okay, so those things become the issue. You will have to think about transport for each of them. But in a one-on-one interview, even if you have to think about transport, it is for one person or at most two. Okay. All right. So you can easily relate this to discuss certain limitations of focus group discussion. Okay. We discussed the instances where focus group shines. You can also look at instances where in-depth interview will shine based on some of the issues discussed here. What about the downside of in-depth interviews? Cost in terms of time and money. Because of the depth of knowledge you want to extract from a single individual, you may spend more time in getting that information. With focus group, we said ideally it should be between maximum 2 hours. And in that short period of 2 hours, you are getting a lot of information from multiple perspectives at a time. In in-depth interview, you will get a lot of information, but it's because it is coming from one person, it might take a longer discussion to get it. And to complete your study, you may have to conduct a number of the one-on-one interviews. And if you look at the time and the expenses you'll have to incur for each interview, it could also be huge. Past focus group can be done in just a day and be done with. In-depth interview might take longer than that, depending on the availability of each of the persons you want to interview. Okay. Now, there is less client involvement in in-depth interview. With in-depth interview, if you pick somebody to conduct the interview for you, there is less involvement with you. But when it comes to focus group, you have to do all the organization and prepare the grounds and then get the moderator to engage in it. But if you engage people to do the in-depth interview for you, there's little arrangement you have to do apart from getting the consent of the people who will be the interviewers. All right. And you are not able to cover much material in one day with in-depth interview, just because of the how extensive the discussion could do. How many interviews can you even conduct in a day? It does not allow for group discussion and resolution. So just as it allows you to get an individual's perspective without it being influenced by others. What is the downside is that it doesn't allow you to get multiple perspectives on the issue in a discussion. With focus group, if the matter for discussion is contentious, you are able to get multiple perspectives during data collection and make resolutions, resolve points of differences, because you have brought people with different perspectives or different backgrounds together. So you are able to resolve contentious issues or controversial issues in focus group. But then when it is in-depth, you take what the person tells you. There are no other perspectives presented at the point of data collection. Okay. Now, some respondents' reactions cannot be generated from one-on-one sessions. Yes. Often when you're in a group discussion, a question may be asked, and you may feel like you don't have an opinion to the question. But as soon as somebody starts speaking, then it triggers something in you and you realize, you did have an opinion. Then you are able to speak to the issue also. You normally hear, let me add to what my colleague said. But some of these, and then sometimes to elicit certain emotions, how someone will speak to an issue might trigger certain emotions in another person on the panel to also speak or react in a certain way. Here is monotone, just you and the interviewer. So there isn't much of dynamics to bring about to elicit these emotions and reactions on a one-on-one session. So you have this list of advantages and disadvantages for focus group, for interviews. You can work your way around them to also discuss amongst yourself the advantages and disadvantages of focus group. So clearly, hopefully you can distinguish between the two, talk about their advantages and their disadvantages, and talk about scenarios when each of these qualitative approaches can be utilized in research. All right, there are other methods like the hermeneutic research method, and it focuses on interpretation through observation of behaviors. Okay, and a typical example is the ethnographic research. So you go to the ground, you observe, you interact with people, you observe, then you make your deductions. And then there is the Delphi method, which involves numerous rounds of data collection. The purpose here is to, at the end of the day, come out with a more structured questionnaire. So you may use several qualitative approaches, asking questions from different experts at different times, allowing them to freely speak to an issue of importance to you, their own perspectives. Then when you have put all these rounds of data collection exercise together, you are able to come up with a more structured questionnaire that will be used for a more quantitative oriented study. So whenever you use these kind of multiple data collection around for the purpose of arriving at a more structured data collection instrument, then we call that Delphi method. So in this sense, you speak to really, you target experts in the field or around the issue you are interested in studying to get their to gather knowledge from them in order to construct a more structured data collection instrument. Okay. There are other qualitative techniques like projective test that seeks to tap into the respondent's deepest feelings by projecting certain images and drawings that elicit some sort of emotions or try to mimic certain feelings and deep emotions about the respondents. So in group chat, in chats, in our chat applications these days, we use a lot of emojis that seems to mimic projective tests. So people can smile, though they can smile on their phone, though they are not smiling, but that is the deep emotion. You see them, they might not be smiling whilst texting, but they are expressing the deeper emotion in them through the text by using these images. Okay. All right. Some general thoughts about qualitative research. Okay. It is more of attitudinal perceptions and belief differences, and these are revealed through qualitative research. And then the question is, they might not be measured, and even if they are measured, they cannot be measured more precisely. So quantitative research will be more precise in terms of measuring the differences in attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs. Sometimes the misconception is that when we are studying these more of social phenomena like attitudes, perceptions, and beliefs, we must use qualitative studies alone. No. That is in the realm of social science. We also adopt the scientific approach where we can apply positivist view of research to studying social phenomena, where in quantitative design, we will try to precisely capture these social phenomena. So a behavior, an attitude, or a perception, or a feeling, or a belief, even though it is purely a social construction, while a qualitative design may try to describe it, but not precisely describe the extent to which somebody's feeling differs from another person's feelings, a quantitative design of that same study will try to more precisely put a metric or a quantity or a numeric value on the feeling, the attitude, the perception of one person to the other person, so that we can quantitatively determine the magnitude of deviation from one person's attitude or feeling from the other person's attitude or feeling. So qualitative research is often not statistically representative of the general population because of the detail you have to go through with each respondent. You are not able to cover plenty respondents. If it's interview, you're not able to conduct so many interviews. So at the end of the day, you will get some depth of knowledge, but it is not generalizable. It is difficult to, because your sample is not very representative of the population. But when it comes to quantitative method, you are able to sample a huge number of respondents from the population, such that the sample becomes representative of the population and conclusions drawn can be generalized to the broader population. So what then is the future of qualitative research? Doesn't mean qualitative research is archaic and should be tossed into the bin. And the answer is an absolute no. No research method or approach is necessarily outdated. Each of them is applicable to specific situations. It's more applicable to specific situations at hand. So depending on what you want to study, a qualitative study may be more suitable. It may even precede a quantitative study, or it can even be conducted after a quantitative study. Okay, so the phenomena that warrant the use of qualitative studies are still with us. Consumers' behavior and emotions and subconscious contents can be well elicited by qualitative research. So we still use them and will continue to use them into the future. Perhaps until we all become robots and AIs so that we may not have emotions. Unless they are able to build emotions into AIs, then qualitative will also continue to be useful. So sometimes respondents verbalize their emotions and feelings best by indirect communication techniques. Sometimes what you hear people say and how they act is contradictory. Or sometimes what people say may be taken lightly, but when you were privy to how they were acting, their facial expressions, when they spoke it would make better and a different sense to you than just hearing what they said. So sometimes even in a quantitative study, it becomes necessary to conduct a qualitative, collect qualitative data to triangulate, to help you firmly establish your findings. So in as much as we still exist as social beings who have feelings, beliefs, and emotions that may sometimes not expressed verbally or in writing, but in unspoken actions, qualitative studies will remain important today and in the foreseeable future. So any question or contribution from you on constructing qualitative data before we look at quantitative data? Any question or comment or contribution to be shared? All right, if you do, make sure to raise your hand so I'll see. Constructing quantitative data. It is more about determining how you capture the data, capture it more reliably and validly so that you can make inferences from the data. So there are three issues that borders around capturing quantitative data or constructing quantitative data. You must understand data structure. You must understand the scales of values. You must understand measurement and measurement error. Remember, quantitative studies seems to tend to adopt the positivist approach, where in our in the process of capturing knowledge, we are trying to accurately and precisely measure, quantify the variables we are studying. So whatever instrument you are taking out there to collect the data is also termed as a measurement instrument. So at the end of the day, that instrument can measure the data more validly and reliably, or it could be capturing error. So when constructing or designing a study, a quantitative study, these are three key things you need to address or be concerned about the data construction. We will look at them in detail. So, quantitative data, it is pre-structured at the point of data capture. You need to structure it before you go to the field to capture it. You need to have sat down to think thoroughly through what statements will help me capture those quantitative data. How am I going to capture them? How am I going to record them? And how am I going to analyze them and interpret them? When you think clearly through this, then what it means is that you have pre-structured it before the point where you collect them. If you have not thought through, you will always come back again and repeat yourself again. It is the result of the process of measurement and scaling. So, as I mentioned earlier, you are trying to precisely quantify, capture a phenomenon. So, it's about measurement and scaling. Your instrument of measure must have a scale. So you can measure the magnitude, the intensity, the length, the degree of one variable from one unit of analysis to another unit of analysis. And quantitative data is numeric in its characteristics, whilst qualitative data may take the form of text, images, videos, audio, and so forth. When it comes to quantitative, the values assume numeric characters. So, what are the strengths of quantitative data or quantitative studies as compared to a purely qualitative study? The effort intensity for capturing quantitative data is less when you look at the labor intensity. The effort every enumerator will have to make to collect the data is less intensive. It's a matter of delivering the questionnaire to the intended respondents and returning to retrieve it. If it's online, it's a matter of using whether Google Forms or whatever, SurveyMonkey, Kubo Collect, or whatever to design and just deploy it on various social media platforms or through emails. People will respond to it, and before you know, your responses are in your inbox or your drive. It's possible to be objective. Yes, it is possible for you, the researcher, to distance yourself from influencing the answers. You are not there to ask the questions to inject some sort of intimidation or elicit some emotions from the respondents. You just put a metric to the questions on the questionnaire and you send it at their own time, at their own pace, without supervision. The respondent will respond to your questionnaires and return them. If the archival data that has been accumulated over time, company sales, company profit information, you can just capture them without you, the researcher, injecting any biases in them or influence on those data you are collecting. And it is easy to analyze because it is numeric and there are plenty available softwares that can easily add, find averages, and compute standard deviations, all the moments you are interested in, and then even perform inferential analysis for you to make inferences from the data. Just through the clicks of buttons, you are able to do it. Qualitative, you have to go through the rigor of observing, transcribing, and analyzing every text in context, examining the emotions attached to them to make sense out of it. But with quantitative, subject the data to a software and they will do all for you. All you need to do is to interpret the final results. Then there's a good basis for generalization when it comes to quantitative data, because you are able to collect data from a wider range of respondents who are representative of the population you are trying to study. So that because the responses are coming from a representative sample of the population, it is easy for you to generalize your conclusions from the study. Then reliability and validity can easily be established. There are quantitative tools and techniques, or statistical tools and techniques, that enables you to determine the reliability and the validity of quantitative data. It is difficult to actually establish reliability and validity for qualitative data. If you record an interview between two people, how will you be able to tell whilst the interview was going on, the interviewer was issuing some verbal cues that put fear into the respondent or the interviewer for them to respond the way they did? You cannot tell that from an audio. Okay. Even from a video, when the camera is not focusing on the interviewer could make some gestures that will suggest something to the interviewee to influence their responses. But how do you establish that? So take an ethnographic study where somebody goes to live with a group of people he wants to understand their way of life. There is no way of establishing that the interviewer, the researcher injected some sort of bias or no bias during his stay with the people, because all you get to know is his personal description of how he went about it. You take it as given. You can't really establish reliability and validity with qualitative data in a qualitative data. But for quantitative, there are tools that we can use to establish reliability and validity of the data. Okay. And then, so with qualitative data, there is a high leap of faith, because you just have to believe and assume that the data is valid and reliable. If he collected the data from the cleaner and he tells you he collected it from the manager, there is no way of telling. But trust me, with quantitative data, you can easily be betrayed, because when we conduct reliability and validity tests, some of these anomalies will show up. Okay. It might not be so explicit, but it will tell you that there is a red flag. Something doesn't belong here. So through the practical sessions, we try to demonstrate some of these things for you to see. And then, okay, Francis.
Please, can you give an example of how to test for reliability and validity? Is this something like the checking for outliers?
Okay. Checking for outliers are part of data cleaning. Okay. Trying to identify maybe cases in the sample that does not seem to belong to the population. Okay. We call them outliers. Extreme cases, extreme instances. For instance, you take this your class, you expect that per the level, you should expect a minimum age of like 20, right? It's a master's class, so a minimum age of, let's say, 20, and then maximum.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, I get the outliers case, but I'm just asking, is it an example of checking for validity in a data?
No.
Okay, so what are some of the examples of checking for validity in a data?
Sure. I didn't want us to go into that right now because we will definitely get there. But the tools we use for checking validity and reliability statistically for quantitative data include Cronbach's Alpha, and then composite reliability. And then for validity.
Then when we get there, then we do it. That's fine.
Exactly.
Thank you.
So
thank you.
We will do all that. Okay. So there are explicit methods and techniques for analyzing them, and they are easily and readily available. So even Excel like this can do plenty than you can imagine when it comes to analyzing quantitative data. And of course, SPSS, which we will introduce you to in this course. There are other numerous SASCAL packages that are available and SASCAL tools in them that you can use to analyze your entire quantitative data compared to qualitative. Yes, qualitative, we have NVivo, MaxQDA, and some other softwares, but they are not as, the techniques and the tools are not as available, or yeah, like when you compare to quantitative data. Okay. And the qualitative softwares can be stupidly costly when you compare to the quantitative ones. So those are the good side of quantitative studies. You can relatively conduct a quantitative study cheaply when you compare to qualitative studies. Okay. How about its weakness? Descriptions and explanations can be superficial. Yes, it's just numbers you subjected to the software. It might generate relationships, but it doesn't mean they really exist. So at the end of the day, your interpretation of those statistics can just be superficial. It can be anything. It might not mean the real thing you are trying to project. And it's the reason why your quantitative studies should be firmly grounded in theory before you even go and collect data, because it is the theory that makes us have confidence in the analysis you get. It's not the data that gives us confidence. You demonstrating there is a good reason why certain variables should be related will now give us grounds to accept the statistical descriptions and relationships established. All right. Sometimes with quantitative data, it is difficult to establish sequence of events. It has been presented to you. How do you know event E occurred before event B? Except when you have collected longitudinal data, when you specify when a particular event occurred and the data was collected. Other than that, with studies like cross-sectional data, how do you tell operations occurred before performance? By looking at the variables, you cannot tell. Okay. Now, pre-structuring of quantitative studies means that the structure needs to be set up in advance of the data capture. It calls for you having a knowledge about how you are going to summarize the data, analyze it, and interpret it before you even design the procedure to collect it. So, but with qualitative, even though you are expected to have an idea how you go about, because how to analyze is so flexible, so subjective in nature, pre-structuring is a little less. As you go to the field, you learn new things on the field, and you can even make some changes alongside. you can make amendments there and there. You ask a question and the question seems to generate the kind of responses you were not expecting. There and there, you are able to learn on your feet and then make amendments. All right, so let's zoom into the issues we're thinking about: data, quantitative data construction. So one of the issues we talked about was we pointed out earlier was data structure, and then scaling and values. I'm referring to, yes, this slide, and then measurement and measurement error. So we are taking data structure, and then we'll go through the rest. So the structure of quantitative data takes these three key characteristics. You are collecting data from objects that you are studying. Those objects that you are studying are the cases. If your study is about organizations and you are collecting data about organizations, then the organizations become the cases. Another word for cases is units of analysis. Now, the attributes about the cases that you are collecting the data on, they are called the variables. So if we are conducting a study in your class, then the constituents of the class, that is the class members, the students, become the unit of analysis or the cases. Now, when we pick each student, we may want to capture certain information or data on the student, such as gender, level of study, specialization, age, and then maybe employment status. These characteristics about the cases we are collecting the data on, each of them is a variable. It's a variable because when you pick case 1 or student 1, his age or her age will vary from student 2's age, okay? It assumes that variable age will assume different variables among the cases or among the units of analysis or among the students. And then we have values. Values are the measure or the value we are assigned to, or the quantity we assign to the variable we are trying to measure. So when you pick student A, that is case 1, and you try to capture a variable like age of student 1, the value you assign to student 1's age is what we call, or the quantity you assign to it is what we call the value. So age, the value of age will be in years. So the quantities you write, how you try to capture assign a quantity to the variables you are measuring on the cases is what we call the values, okay? They are the numeric quantities the variables assume for each of the cases you are studying. So you must have a mental picture of how cases are constructed. So let me just, I think we'll come to that. So when we come to the practical section, I'll demonstrate to you how pictorially we organize cases, variables, and values. Let me try to picture this in your mind. Cases usually take the rows. Case 1, case 2, all up to the last case you study. They take up the rows. Data structure always appears in the form of a table. Usually, it appears in the form of a table. And for most of the common way of organizing quantitative data, you will have the cases constituting the rows in the table. And the first, and variables constituting the columns the columns in the table. Then, so variable names or labels will become the header or the header for the columns. The column names will take the variable names or labels. And then the row labels will take the ID for the cases. So student 1, student 2, student 3, up to the rest. And then what you find in between the metrics created by the rows and the columns will be the values. So as we go on, we will demonstrate this to you. You know them already, but when we speak about them like this, sometimes it's difficult to relate with. All right. So different kinds of cases depending on the research you are undertaking. It can be individuals, like students, like employees. It can be groups. It can be organizations. It can be events. It can be physical objects, like vehicles. It can be areas or towns or cities or ethnic communities. So variables, like we mentioned earlier, are the characteristics about the cases that you want to study about, okay? And they vary, and there can be different types of them that can be constructed. So we will look at the details as we move ahead. All right. So the word value has many different connotations, but just as I explained earlier, we may record numbers as metric quantities, numbers as identifiers of categories or words or phrases. The values we assign to our measure of each variable, we are saying may take different forms. For instance, when you take gender, we can put numeric values for the measure of gender. We can assign the number 0 to the male gender, and we can assign the number 1 to the female gender. In that case, these numbers are acting as identifiers of the gender of the respondents, but not a quantitative meaning, in that 0 means the absence of gender and 1 means the presence of gender. No, it's just numbers being used to identify categories. So beware of that when we talk about values or the metrics on the variables we are trying to measure or capture. So when it comes to the scales of the value, think of the scale as when you pick a ruler, the markings on it in centimeters or in inches, and how to interpret them. Every measurement tool has a scale. If you go to the butchery, they have a scale for weighing the weight of flesh. I mean, a beacon or whatever they are selling. So the scales enables us to calibrate one measure from the other measure. When we pick a variable, we are able to determine or assign a quantity to it when we measure it using the scale of that particular measure or measuring instrument. So there are several scales the values we assign to variables when we measure them can take. It can be binary, nominal, ordinal, ranked, or metric. So we will look at this in detail. When a scale is binary, it means there are 2 categories. It doesn't go beyond 2 categories. Binary means 2. And a typical example is male and female gender, but only when you are speaking in the context of Ghana. Nowadays, when you go outside Ghana, gender is an excluded variable where we have plenty categories than we have here in our country, male and female. Okay, so whenever the variable you are trying to capture assumes only 2 categories, then it becomes a binary scale. However you are going to measure it, you can only measure it, it can only take 2 forms. So that variable assumes the binary scale. And a typical example is gender, male and female, in the context of Ghana. Right. Then we have the nominal scales. They are similar to binary. The only difference is that they can assume more than 2 categories. They can assume more than 2 categories. And remember, when we talk about binary and nominal scales, the grouping it does, we call it nominal because it does not make one group better than the other. Male is not better than female. In the context of studying and research, we only try to put things into groups that they belong to. This scale does not make one group better than the other. It only tries to assign the units of analysis into the groups they belong to. It doesn't attach any qualitative, assign any sort of significance to one group and less significance to the other group. So male is male, female is female. It is just the way they exist. That's all. So nominal scale also assumes the same notion, but puts and make room for more than 2 categories. So whenever your groupings of your units of analysis or cases per a particular variable goes beyond 2 groups, then it assumes the nominal scale. So you can think of a variable like ethnic group. You can have so many ethnic groups. You cannot say one ethnic group is better than the other. That is not our interpretation of it. We just want to recognize the fact that people belong to different ethnic groups. And in Ghana, we have uncountable number of ethnic groups. I don't know the finite number. If you know them, fine. But in a typical study, you expect to get more than 2 ethnic groups in the study. Then that variable will assume a nominal scale. Nationality, Ghanaian, Nigerian, Liberian, whatever. They are simply groups. And they take that variable, nationality takes more than 2 categories. So we classify the scale for that kind of variable under nominal. And there is no particularity in terms of the order when it comes to a nominal scale. So an example is nationality. We only indicate the different nationalities and then we rank them. We use frequency to capture the number of times they appear in the study. Okay. Then we have ordinal. In ordinal, just as the name suggests, we are able to make some sense in terms of order or progression in the various groups or the data values we capture. So relationship between values can be defined in terms of greater than or less than. When you can determine the magnitude of the values we assign to the variables, then we say that, and you can order them in terms of magnitude, whether ascending or descending, then that variable assumes an ordinal scale. So for instance, age group can become ordinal. Something like level of education can become ordinal. Okay. So ordinal comes with ranking. So students can be ranked in terms of their scores. So their rank in one score might differ from another score. So as you can see in the table. So the values assigned here, 1, 2, 3, only tells us their rank. Sometimes the interpretation of rank or the numeric values assigned to ordinal skills or rank skills, its interpretation should be very careful. You should be very careful with its interpretation. Sometimes we use a smaller number to mean a higher rank. And sometimes we use a larger number to mean a higher rank. So when you are using ordinal skill, you should know how you are interpreting the value. Sometimes a smaller value means a higher rank. And in some instances, a larger value means a higher rank. Okay, and vice versa. So that is one thing you must take note when we talk about ranked or ordinal skills. Okay. Now, metric. Metric is the highest form of scales for values. Okay. And we have what we call the continuous metric and the discrete metric. With a continuous metric, it happens as a result of calibration. So think of instruments like the meter rule or the tape measure or something like the measuring scale. The minutest change in the calibration is has a significant meaning. Okay. So apart from assigning whole numbers to the variables, the interval between one whole number and the other whole number, there can exist numerous calibrations in there that make sense. So for instance, when you pick 1 centimeter, the gap between 1 centimeter to 2 centimeters, every minute change that can occur above 1 meter, but below 2 meter or 2 meters is of essence. It shows us a deviation from the starting point that is calibrated in our measurement of the variables. So the number of scale values is infinite. You can break it down, divide, multiply, and it will make sense. Every decimal point makes sense to us, okay? Now, when it comes to discrete measures, it is as a result of counting. So making things like divisions that result into decimal points doesn't make sense. So we round them up to only interpret the whole numbers, counting numbers. So when it comes to discrete measures, think about counting numbers. Variables that we use the counting numbers for. Number of people. You can't have 0.5 number of people. It is either 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. All right. So you realize that for discrete measures, the calibrations and the number of scale values is quite finite. It's not as infinite as when you think about things like checking the width of a person, checking the height of a person, checking the age of a person, days count, hours count. You can disintegrate it into the finest, minutest points, and each of those minutest or infinitesimal points makes meaning. It brings about distinction. But when you are counting people, you can't count 1.5 people. There is nothing like that. When you are counting cars, you can't count 1.5 car. No. they are discrete, and we use counting numbers for them. So those are the highest form of scales we can use in our quantitative studies. So an example of a continuous metric, age. An example of discrete metric, 1 person, 2 person, you see, household size, okay? All right. So this presents just a simple classification. We have of scale types, non-metric and metric. So the non-metric are the ones we explained earlier: binary, nominal, ordered, and ranked, all fall within non-metric. And then the continuous and discrete fall under what we call the metric. And the continuous being the highest among these, okay? So we have barely, that's about 22 minutes to end the session today. I'll just introduce you to the next session, which has to do with measurement validation and stuff like that. And then the last session will be with inferential statistics, with regression. So these sessions will involve us discussing some things theoretically, and as well using some of the software to demonstrate what we are discussing. So per the design, that is how it's going to be. So at this point, if you have questions with what we have discussed so far, you can ask. If you have contributions to make, you can bring them, so that I'll just introduce you to the next session, and then we can prepare to meet next week also. So any questions so far from our discussion? Hello, Francis.
Yes, Henry, thank you so much. My question is, when it comes to qualitative research, there is a need for hypothesis. Is there also a need for hypothesis when you're undertaking a quantitative research?
I think you make them up, or?
I've mixed them up rather.
Yes. Quantitative hypothesis, because of the positivist philosophical stance, you begin with a theory and a hypothesis, then you collect data to test those hypotheses. But for qualitative, generally, it begins with you collecting data to identify patterns that might suggest or lead you to a theory. So with qualitative, in its rawest form, okay, in its basic form, does not require any tentative statement, because to make that tentative statement means you must back it with strong theory, which is usually not the case. Now, one thing we need to understand is that these classifications and descriptions are not cast in stones. Qualitative studies have evolved over time and have become more complex than accepting the basic tenet, which is that you begin collecting data, you make observations that lead into you arriving at a theory. Sometimes the phenomenon has been studied over time, or there are other theories that helps you to build a prior knowledge before you even go into the field to do your qualitative study, which means that prior to even going to the collect the data in your qualitative study, depending on the phenomenon you are studying, how much we know about it, you are able to come up with what we call a mind map, a framework we call a mind map, such that you have related incidents about the phenomenon you want to study, that kind of gives you a preconceived notion about how it will turn out in the current situation. So you build yourself around that knowledge in the prior existing knowledge to guide you how to study your qualitative study right in the empirical settings. So whilst it does not necessitate that you must come out with a tentative statement, a hypothesis that you test with the data at the end of the day, the evolvement of qualitative study in our era does not also strictly preclude that you can draw on existing knowledge to embark on your qualitative study. So because of that, you will sometimes come across qualitative studies that even begins with discussing certain theories that are related to the phenomenon they want to go and study. They may end up making statements what they are expecting to see on the field, but they are more relaxed and open. So the understanding I want you to get here for practical purposes is that whilst it is not a requirement in qualitative study to come out with hypotheses and research models, you can come up with what we call a mind map, provided there is existing literature that will help you construct that mind map that will lead you into studying the qualitative phenomenon more appropriately. So it is not a requirement, but when it comes to quantitative, it becomes sort of a requirement. Have I answered your question?
Yes, it's very clear. So in this case, I can say hypothesis is synonymous to research objective.
They are related, okay? The objectives is what will lead you to construct hypothesis. The hypothesis, we will show you examples when we go on, okay? The hypothesis is a statement you make, a position you take on that research question you are trying to resolve, or that research objective you are trying to analyze. Prior to collecting data, you make a statement, you take a position about what you expect it to be like based on sound logic, sound argument like we did yesterday. So for instance, from yesterday's example about attitude towards internet usage and attitude towards internet security, the research question could be, how does internet usage influence attitude towards internet security? Or in terms of objective, to determine the relationship between internet usage and attitude towards internet security. Then a practical or a practical hypothetical statement will be that after you have reviewed literature and theories or various logics to help you prior to collecting data, guess how internet usage will influence attitude towards internet security. Then you can take a position that high internet usage will most likely result in a positive, or will be associated with a more positive attitude towards internet security. That is a hypothesis. You are saying that as we increase our level of internet usage, the more positive attitude we will cultivate towards internet security. That is a position you have taken based on your reading of existing studies and examination of how things work, theory. But it is not a definite statement because you are yet to test it with empirical data. So that is the difference between hypothesis and objective. The objective is to establish the relationship, that the nature of the relationship that exists between these two variables. But the hypothesis will take a position prior to testing it. It will take a position based on a strong logical argument against which empirical data can be used to test that statement. I hope that is also understood.
Very clear. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. So, any other question? Let's see. Session 4. Okay. Okay. All right. So let me just preview you to session 4. And then let's see. Okay. So session 4, we will focus much more on the practical aspect of constructing quantitative data. Okay. So the instrument we will be using to capture quantitative data is what will be our subject of discussion here. And by that, we will be using the questionnaire, okay? We'll be using the questionnaire. We will try to understand how to even construct a questionnaire, construct it well to capture the kind of data we intend to capture. So there's a lot and interesting stuff here that we can learn. So there are theoretical aspects of it where we will discuss the steps in capturing, in designing a questionnaire, okay? And let me see. We will revisit theory again, but just how we practicalize or we will operationalize our theory in terms of defining the concepts and coming out with indicators that capture those concepts, indicators we can really capture from the field that help us capture or measure the notion, the abstract notion we are trying to measure and all that. So I think, yeah. So it's more about learning how to construct a valid questionnaire, a valid and reliable questionnaire. And after you have collected your data, some of the relevant issues concerning reliability and validity, how to validate them in order to have a final data that you can analyze to make inferences from your data. So let me see. Yeah. So validation, alpha. Okay. All right. So that's what we'll be doing in our next section. And clearly, we'll be discussing this theoretical aspect first. And to demonstrate it, we will actually use a real data to analyze through the software so that you understand how we assess reliability and validity when you have a piece of data. Okay, so I'll advise that you try and get SPSS installed on your computers for the remainder of the sessions, okay, because we'll be combining a little of theory and then some practice. We'll be demonstrating some of the validation approaches using the software. So we'll mixing the slides with practice. So let's embrace ourselves for that. So I will send the materials to the class rep today, right after here, so that he can share with the rest of you. Try and go through them before we meet for the next session. Okay. So that